Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to be talking about differences between different levels of revelation. So the idea of the law, the prophets, and the writings. Kind of a Christian tradition on this subject is the idea that every single word in the 1647 Bible, the Bible that was compiled in 1647, the idea that every single word, whether it says it's from God or not, is somehow from God. The idea that it is all an equal level of inspiration. So if you look at Song of Solomon or something like that, or if you look at the passage in Chronicles when it talks about the guy urinating on the wall, somehow that is on the same level as the book of Numbers or something like that, where it says that God said this to Moses, or where it says, thus says the name, and that sort of thing, that somehow that these two are on the same level. Now, also, there's a Jewish tradition, or some sets of Jewish traditions on this issue. They have what's called the TNK, or the Tanakh. And the Tanakh is divided into three categories: law, prophets, and writings, or Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Now they view it in a different way than I do, and we'll talk about that. But basically there are various traditions depending on who you ask. Some have the idea that you can somehow look to Proverbs and see a command in Proverbs, and somehow that makes it Torah, that makes it law. Some seem to believe that. Others seem to put a little more elevation to the law, and then maybe close to the same elevation to prophets, and then writings a little bit lower than that. But what is the distinction in the Torah? What is the distinction according to the commandments? And we want to talk about that. We want to look into what the law says, what the text says, rather than just what all these traditions say. And the first thing I will draw your attention to is Deuteronomy 4:2 and Deuteronomy 12:32. Deuteronomy 4:2 and 12:32 state that we are not allowed to add to the law or to take away from the law, so that we will keep the commandments of God that are being delivered to us through Moses. And it specifies, it refers to the commandments that I am giving to you from God. So these commandments that are being given, the Torah, the law that is being given to us by Moses from God, is set at a certain level because we're not allowed to add to it or take away from it. And this even applies in the case of prophets, because if we look at Deuteronomy 12:32, it immediately goes into the next verses talking about how to test prophets. So in Deuteronomy 13:1 through 5, we start talking about the testing of prophets and how do we distinguish between a true prophet and a false prophet. Now, the distinction is a little bit different than some people are used to. The distinction is not just based upon signs and wonders, for example. And it even says, contrary to what some might expect, it indicates that signs and wonders can accompany false prophets. So if we're looking at the test of prophets, it's not just that they have signs or wonders accompanying them, but as we see in Deuteronomy 13:5, it says that a false prophet we are dismissing because he has sought to cause us to be thrust from the way which we are commanded to walk. Now, what is the way we are commanded to walk? Well, we're commanded to walk according to the Torah. Now, what would it mean to be thrust from the way we are commanded to walk? It would mean we are being taught to violate the commands. One of the commands is we're not supposed to add to the law or take away from it. And so if a prophet is coming along and he is teaching, from now on we're doing such and such command, or something like that, or from now on the people need to do this, this is the new way about things, that's adding to the law, and it's not allowed. And if we listen to him, if we assume that he's truly from God and we assume that he is valid, then we're listening to that prophet and we're breaking the command as a result. We're adding to the law, not allowed. And likewise, if a prophet came along and said, hey, such and such commandment or such and such set of commandments were fulfilled, or some argument that they'll try to make sound persuasive, that we don't need to worry about this anymore, well, they're taking away from the law. That's not allowed either. So in those cases, such a person is a false prophet, and therefore we can also conclude that true prophets aren't going to be allowed to do that. If that makes them a false prophet, the true prophet's not going to come along and add to the law or take away from the law. So as a result, we kind of have the law up at this higher level. We're testing prophets according to the law, and the law is not allowed to be added to or taken away from. So the commandments in the law, in a sense, are kind of fixed. They're not allowed to be altered by a prophet, and any prophet who tries to do it is automatically false. So therefore, let's consider, a prophet's going to have to be at a lower level than that. A prophet can't alter the law. A prophet can't come along, add to it, or take away from it. So obviously, they're at a lower level. So what is the role of prophets? And let's consider Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 22. Deuteronomy 18 talks about the role of prophets, and it tells us that there will be future prophets. There will be prophets which come after Moses, which are valid. And it even tells us that we are supposed to listen to these prophets, assuming that they are a true prophet. Now, at the end of Deuteronomy 18, it talks about kind of an implied skepticism about prophets. It says that what do you do if you say that, how do I know whether a prophet's true or not? How do I know whether this is truly from God? And it says to look for fulfillments, to look for signs, to look for evidence that indeed these things are coming true and that it's a valid prophecy. So the test is not just, are they pro-Torah or not? We already talked about they're not allowed to add to the law or take away from the law. But that's not the only criterion that we're looking at. We're also looking at, is there evidence of signs and fulfillments? If there's this built-in skepticism, which seems to be implied by Deuteronomy 18, if there's this skepticism that we're not just going to assume that anyone who comes along is a prophet, then there is this idea of looking for signs, looking for wonders, looking for fulfillments. And once again, it's not just looking for one of these. We're looking for both. We're looking for both that they're not violating the law and they're not teaching us to violate the law, not adding to it or taking away from it. And we're also looking for evidence of fulfillments, signs, wonders, etc. It's not just one or the other, and kind of get into that trap in a sense, because people talk about, well, there's miracles accompanying this person, or there are writings about a person performing miracles. That's not the only criterion. Or the idea of, well, I read through this book and it seemed pro-Torah, so therefore it must be true. That's not the only criterion either. In my view, Deuteronomy 18 supports this, that there is this inherent skepticism. We're not just going to automatically assume anyone who claims to be speaking for God, we're not just going to assume that they are. We're going to test them and we're going to check it out. Now, clearly there are prophets, and clearly there is a role for prophets. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Deuteronomy 18 saying what it says. And it talks about how we are required to listen to prophets, assuming they're true. Now, if a prophet is not allowed to add to or take away from the law, they're not allowed to be giving us new commands in the sense of the law. They're not allowed to be changing the law, adding to the law. Then what is this that we're going to be listening to them for? And from my understanding, a prophetic injunction to a specific person or specific group of people for a specific time is not adding to the law. It's a different issue. It's the role of what a prophet would do. So just as a completely hypothetical example, say a prophet comes along and say there's reason to believe them, say they made a prophecy before and it came true, and we witnessed this occur. They didn't just tell us that it did. And so we've seen a sign that, yeah, they do seem to be receiving things from God. And then say they hypothetically tell us that God told them, we're supposed to go teach so-and-so about the Torah, for example. That is a command in the sense of we're being told it for a specific time, in a specific situation. It's not being given as this is the new way that the whole nation is to behave from here on out. Or this is the way that all the people that follow God, all the people that seek to obey God need to do. It's not that at all. That's a completely different level of thing. It's a completely different issue. It's not adding to the commands. It's not taking away from the commands. It's not approaching the issue of the law. It's automatically at a lower level than the law. It's not being applied just generally. So in my view, the role of a prophet is to instruct people in specific situations regarding specific issues for a specific time. It's not the role of a prophet to come along and give an entirely new revelation or to give new commands and new laws. That's not what they're allowed to do. There is the level of the law, that fixed level where it cannot be changed. And so a prophet can't do anything about that. The prophet is at a lower level than that. They can give instructions from God for us for specific times, that sort of thing, but it's not law. It's still something that we need to listen to according to Deuteronomy 18, assuming that they are valid, but it is not new commands. So if we think about making the distinction between the law and prophetic revelation, then what about the issue of writings? Now, and like I said before, in Orthodox Judaism and some other Jewish groups, they have the idea, the tradition of the T and K, the law, the prophets, and the writings. So if we talk about it in the sense of the writings, we're going to be making a different distinction than they normally would. So a writing might be something like a history book, a book of wisdom or advice, or even a book that is about teaching the law, for example, but does not claim to be prophecy. Now, if we look at books of history in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, or Old Testament as people call it, if we look at books of prophecy in there, books of history in there, we might see it's talking about various events that went on, various conversations, and then someone appears that claims to be a prophet and makes a prophecy. Now, that little chunk where they're making the prophecy, that is claiming to be a prophecy. But that doesn't suddenly make the whole work into a prophecy. It doesn't suddenly cause the whole work to be inspired. It is isolating that chunk and saying that this is something someone claimed to be a prophecy. It doesn't mean that the whole book, therefore, is prophecy. So if we're talking about, for example, the 1647 canon, if we're talking about if someone accepts the New Testament, for example, there are a lot of books that don't even claim to be inspired. For example, the non-Pauline epistles, just for example, they don't claim to be inspired in general. The book of Hebrews, it's just a set of teachings and a set of opinions of this one guy. And he doesn't ever say that this is a prophecy or anything. So even though it is about a theological context, even though it is talking about those subjects, that doesn't make it a prophecy. Just like some pastor gives some sermon, that's not automatically inspired or prophecy or anything, especially if they don't consider it that, especially if they're not telling you that it is. So that's a writing. Just like the history books, where it just is giving us an account of history, just like books of advice or poetry like Song of Solomon or something like that. Just because it ended up in a book of prophecy and law, just because it ended up rolled into that traditional canon, does not automatically mean it is a prophecy, nor does it automatically mean it is a valid prophecy for that matter. So writings they're not on the same level at all when we're talking about law and the prophets. They're not even claiming to be. So a book of advice or a book of Proverbs, for example, we're not going to be looking at Proverbs and say, this is this guy's advice, therefore it must be law. We're not going to be saying that. That's just not how it works. So there are these writings or this general category of, it doesn't matter what subject matter it is, it's just not even claiming to be revelation of God. So it is separate from the law and the prophets. So when we talk about this distinction between law, prophets, and writings, we can clearly see that the law sets itself at a level above all else. That the law contains the criteria with which we test prophets. It contains the criteria of whether we determine a prophet to be true or false, or whether we don't know. And the law is not allowed to be added to or taken away from. So a prophet, even if they're valid, they're not going to be changing the law because the law is at this higher level. So what is the role of a prophet? Prophets can give specific commands for specific times for specific people. They're not adding to the law. They're not giving new commands for all the people that seek to serve the God of Israel type thing. They're not allowed to do that. So a prophet that has signs and wonders accompanying him that we are able to see and is in line with the law, they're still not allowed to add to or take away from the law. It's simply not how the law allows them to work. So we've got law and prophets. And then anything else, we got writings. Things that don't claim to be prophecy, they don't claim to be inspired. So this is kind of a different distinction than what is typically used. It's different than many of the traditional opinions on this subject, both in Christian view and in Jewish view. And I think that it should deserve some serious consideration, considering what the law itself says. Consider what the law itself says in this regard. Consider the text of the law. And make sure you look over Deuteronomy 4:2, Deuteronomy 12:32, and also Deuteronomy 13:1 through 5, which is the immediately following passage, and Deuteronomy 18:15 through 22, where it talks about the distinction between the law and the prophets. Thanks for watching. Feel free to share this video or to like it if you found it to be useful, if you found it to offer a new viewpoint on this issue, offer a new structure to think about law, prophets, and writings in. And feel free to subscribe if you have not already so that we can stay in touch, so we can continue this conversation, and so that we continue looking at other Torah-related issues. Once again, thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Peace.